Hello and welcome to The Right Idea, where we discuss the people, policy, and politics that drive Texas. I'm your host, Brian Phillips. I'm the Chief Communications Officer at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And with me, as always, is my co-host, Derek Cohen, our Vice President of Policy at TPPF. So, have you just been vacationing these last couple of weeks because, session's out and, you got nothing to do?
Well, yeah. Well, just like during session, it's short days, banker's hours, usually home by 3 p.m., that kind of stuff. Didn't say which day 3 p.m., but no. As you know, Brian, we've been taking the show on the road, much like we've had the event here, the panel recap primer here. We ended up in Dallas, Fort Worth yesterday with two events covering the same thing. Obviously, a lot of victories to be mentioned, a lot of stuff still left on the table, and setting that optimistic tone for the rest of the special session.
Yeah.
Notice I said single.
Yeah.
But yeah, setting that optimistic tone, because I think a lot of folks kind of lack that perspective of the fact that a lot of things have been accomplished, and having sanguinity and clarity on that makes it more likely the other stuff will be as well.
And it's always good to get out of Austin. I mean, this is kind of a bubble, especially during session with all the focus here. We're only 2 blocks from the Capitol, so it's even more of a bubble sometimes for us. So it's good. It's good to get out. So how are the people of Texas?
They're great. They're great. I will say, though.
Were they excited about the session, or what was some feedback there?
It was mixed. And first of all, I think some of it was because it was more humid than Houston in DFW yesterday, which was a whole other thing. But I think that if you were to poll the average Texan, which we do, I think you would have some, especially those who follow, that have very high marks for several of the initiatives that went through this year. Mm-hmm. But some of them would have that pale in comparison to some of the opportunities left on the table.
So an incomplete then, really, from the at least the activists and the folks that are really plugged in coming to these kinds of events.
Yeah, and they're definitely not wrong. I mean, we've been promised property tax relief for session after session after session, and it's like that pawn shop meme where it's like, well, the best I can do is make sure your bills don't go up as high or as fast as they were before.
Right.
But we've been promised that year after year, and here we are so close, and we'll talk a little bit about that later.
Yeah.
But people are feeling the pinch there, and of course, obviously, the big elephant in the room, which as you would say that we're obligated to discuss, is school choice. And I know that there's a lot of parents that we met in both engagement activities yesterday, both in the Fort Worth area and the Dallas area, who have many different issues with the parental empowerment work. Some of them wanted full ESA, full school choice. Other ones have more grave concerns about content, about the use of technology in classrooms. All these things are things that, analogs and smaller bites at the apple did happen this session.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, they want that big pie in the sky, which they were promised. And again, the optimistic tone saying, I think that's going to happen.
So there wasn't just an overwhelming, huge standing ovation for not having to take your car in to get inspected anymore?
Well, it was, but it was led only by me. So,
all right. So let's do a little bit of housekeeping first, as I like to do at the beginning of the show. As always, we'd love for you to subscribe to our weekly newsletter. It's called The Post. It's kind of a wrap up of everything TPPF is taking a look at and following and working on, as well as some other state issues, national issues. You can sign up for that newsletter at texaspolicy.com/thepost. There's exclusive content in there as well, so it's not just a rehash of everything that we do. We're also excited that we get our producer back. We've got Jefferson is the man behind the lens is back this week. So I always like to give a shout out to him. And then third, we're going to do now that we're in the special session and certainly not as much as going on as has been happening the last 3 months. We're going to now move the show to every other week as opposed to just every week. And so we'll have a lot more content to kind of generate over the next couple of weeks as things move forward. But just as a note to our loyal listeners and viewers, we're going to do it every couple of weeks. As Derek said, there's going to be some travel, some tours. Hopefully, we'll be in your area. If you want to know if we're coming to your area to do those kinds of events, just check out our events page at texaspolicy.com. Okay, on today's show, we're going to talk about the real property tax problem. Governor Abbott makes DEI DOA on campus. There's been some bill signings here. He's also signed the parent protection bill, a couple of parent protection bills made to the governor's desk that we want to highlight for you. You've heard of California dreaming. Well, one California state senator says you need to do some California leaving. which is exactly what our producer did. Jefferson, we might even have you on to give your thoughts. And then just thought an interesting story that came across my desk. Cigarette companies apparently are highly ethical companies that you should invest in according to some ESG rankings. And so I thought that was an interesting story. We'll hit that later. But first, before we get to the hot topics of the week, the hottest topic going on right now is the hot weather. So I wanted to just start off with something fun and see, Derek, with 150-degree weather on its way, it's Texas, it's June. Do you have any ideas or solutions for our listeners to beat the heat?
Absolutely, and we should have reached out to this company and arranged like a promo code where we get a.
There's still time. We can always edit, right, Jefferson?
Well, we'll have to guess what it is. Enter the right idea. No. One of the things that I recommend, especially folks who have maybe smaller backyards or what have you, is one of the things that we have had in the Midwest that we start to see down here is basically stock tank pools. Essentially what you would use I use a term, and we use up there, water a cow. What you would use that basically a trough in which they drink out of. A
trough?
Well, not necessarily a trough. It's like a circular trough, which I guess that makes it definitionally not a trough. Look, we're gonna get into semantics of water vessels.
I just want you to finish it because now the mental picture is just like some of those old Western movies where they take a bath in the trough.
But there are those troughs, but those are
like
used more
horse
for ice and
drinking out
recovery.
of the other side.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So horse trough in your backyard.
Oh man, come on, Brian. We're professionals here. No,
okay,
but yeah, like a circular one, say 6 to 6, 8, 10 feet across. Put a lining in there, drill holes on the side that they plug in a smaller pool filter, and they essentially are like little mini pools. And the thing is, with a very small footprint, you can actually do that. Like I said, I know there's, like Stock Tank Social Club and cowboy pools and stuff like that. Like I said, again,
wow. It's a whole community of
all this free air,
people swimming in horse troughs.
Yeah,
excellent.
Yeah, you know what? This anti-trophist attitude you have, it just belies your elitist. Right? Maybe at Cranbrook or wherever you went to school, they don't have horse troughs.
They do not. No.
But in Toledo, Ohio, let me tell you how it is, Brian.
Okay.
But no, all that to say is that obviously downtown, if you live close to downtown, though parking's a nightmare and becoming worse, obviously have access to some great spring-fed pools, whether it's Deep Eddy or
there you
go. What am I thinking?
Barton Springs.
Yeah, Barton Springs. Oh my goodness.
Of course. Yeah. Well, and that's just here in Austin. My solution is stay inside.
Yeah.
I look at these lists about how to beat the heat, and all of them are like, go outside. I'm like, no, stay inside. I mean, that's what separates us from the Neanderthals is air conditioning, right? Yeah. So this is Texas. Stay inside. Anyway, all right, well, that's enough of
Diane
that.
Fossey wrote a whole thing about that once the gorillas discovered, how to basically pump in cold air, then they started watching TV
right out of the rainforest. Yeah, straight out of the rainforest. Okay, we have wasted too much time. All right, well, let's get to some more serious topics. Obviously, the big one is property tax and what's going to happen, and all of the back and forth that's going on up at the Capitol. One thing I want to focus on is, look, the good news is that everybody agrees that we're going to get $18 billion in property tax. How that goes down, all those details will come out. It seems like sometimes they're getting close to making a decision, but the good news is we're going to get a ton of property tax. What I think that belies, though, is especially with all the media coverage over the back and forth or over the disagreements on how to do that, is that you don't focus on where the problem actually comes from. And this is why we talk about the real property tax problem, which is that it comes from the local level, that the local governments are the ones who set the rates. And as our property values was great, or are all going up, that of course means that as if they've set a certain rate, all of our bills are going to go up. Now, what a responsible local government would do is to say, okay, because we're getting more and more money in, let's reduce the rate so that we're not burdening taxpayers, right. And we are and we're setting a reasonable amount of money that we need in order to pay our bills. That of course is not what's happening. They're keeping the rates where they are. They're getting these massive windfalls, and then when people demand action, of course, then the fight happens at the state level because the local governments don't do anything. So just one more setup before I want to get your thoughts on this, Derek, just to prove that this is happening and that this is a major issue. We've done the research on this, and we compare the amount of revenue, the percentage of revenue increase going into some of these major population centers here in Texas, and we compare that to something which is, we call it population plus inflation, or it is population plus inflation, which is population growth and inflation. So, obviously as the state gets bigger or as inflation increases, cities and towns will need more money. But that's about the reasonable metric to say, compared to how your city is growing, what is the amount of, growth and revenue that's coming in, okay? So we look at a few cities. Population and inflation, which is the reasonable metric, in Houston grew at 7.6% over the last 5 years. But the revenue grew 46%. In San Antonio, population and inflation grew a little over 4%, but the revenue grew 38%. Sorry to throw a bunch of these numbers at you, but want to let you know that we're not just making this up. In Austin, it was probably the most egregious. Population inflation grew just 10%, while revenue grew 70%. So these cities and towns are taking in this massive windfall, and of course, property owners are getting burdened. This is happening in Dallas and in El Paso and Fort Worth and Corpus Christi. Derek, what do we do about the locals?
Yeah, well, we had this conversation several times before. It's the locals that are really driving much of this crisis, and I think there's a little bit of a hide the ball on this as well. If for all local political subdivisions, or say the vast majority of local political subdivisions, they are capped at 2.5 to 3.5% growth in revenue annually. Pause on existing properties. And you mentioned how population's growing. You mentioned how Texas is growing. You mentioned how Texas business is growing. All of these require new properties. And then that's when the valuation comes in pretty high, and that's where the delta between what it was and what it is going to be that the 40% revenue gain that's above the 2.5%.
So these are I wanted to get into a little bit. In previous sessions, they have tried to pass property tax laws, kind of not necessarily nibbling around the edges, but kind of using a targeted approach. Yeah. And you're saying that the local governments are essentially finding loopholes to get out.
Well, I wouldn't even say it's a loophole
caps.
Because you definitely, and even with the most the local malefactors at all the levels, you don't want to hamstring local growth. I mean, one of the worst things we could do as a state is us trying to stop the Texas economic miracle by basically forbidding growth. No, in fact, we want growth, but what that growth should do is then supplement some of the already existing structure. Now, that growth should not, if the revenue is going up 40%, but population's only growing 10%, there needs to be a very cogent explanation to that and why that is outside the particular bounds of the revenue caps. And so one of the things that we've seen, again, growth should be lauded. We should never push back on Texas
to
growing.
To some extent, housing values should be lauded because we want our value, our houses to grow in value.
But absolutely. But this is where we get to the point on the property tax debate where, depending on what your, you can ask different tax attorneys. You ask 5 of them which is better, Senate or House, you're going to get 6 different answers, and largely it's going to be based on which lens through which they view most property holdings, right? And now we don't need to rehash that. We don't need to microwave that up again. But again, you mentioned it's the fact they agree on the need, they agree on the amount, they agree on the central mechanism via compression and getting at specifically school M&O, which is, anywhere to almost half of people's actual property tax bill. They agree on that. Now, here's the problem, and here's where I think that we need to, I don't want to say raise a flag, but definitely say, hey, guys, you might want to hurry, is the fact that we're actually getting up to the point in the year where local governments are going to set their, drunken sailor budgets. They're going to have, valuations are going to come in, and they're essentially going to have to determine where we're going to be. And it's like, if we were to come in with this particular relief package in the middle of the process, that could upend all that. Now, look, would that, would governments being like frozen in amber and what they can spend, would that offend me? No, not one bit. But the fact being is that we still need to have the locals have the ability to manage. I personally think they need a little more handcuffs on the spending side. I'm more happy to go into that. But that being said, that which we trust them to do, they should be able to do that without the state interrupting that in the middle. In order to do so, then that means we have about a 6-week shot clock on getting this particular thing done. And then it's one of the things where
And now, if it doesn't, it's not like property tax relief goes away. It just means they missed a deadline so that we can feel property tax relief in the immediate year.
Yeah.
That anything that happens after that shot clock expires would be pushed off into the next fiscal year. And so we wouldn't see property tax relief until the following year instead of this year, right?
Right.
Okay.
Well, I mean, there are other mechanisms such as a additional compression mechanism. Let me say that differently. There are other mechanisms such as an additional compression one that is countenanced by HB 3 from 2019 that might lower that M&O portion of some property taxes. Will that be enough to feel? That those numbers aren't available yet, but I would be hard pressed to think that would be considered, the runoff from a bill 2 sessions ago would be considered substantial enough to be declared a victory.
And now, the debate that's happening up on Capitol Hill right now, I think everybody is sort of supportive in one way or another of whatever's going up there. We've always kind of had an all of the above approach, whatever gets property tax bills down. But that really doesn't, at the end of the day, it doesn't solve this problem, which we've identified, which is that the local governments, your city councils and such, are the ones that set the rates, right? You're talking about right now. They're going through this process right now of deciding how much money do we need in order to pay our bills and do all of that. So they're going to set the rates at which they're going to use to generate all of that money. To me, there needs to be some at least focus on that. I don't know if that's whether that's state leaders and state officials that need to look at that, or just we as the public need to get more engaged on this. That's part of this problem here is that some people would say, well, if you don't like the decisions your city council is making, then just vote in new city council members. But ask your average person on the street when are the elections for the city councils? Who's running? Most people are not that plugged in, not only to the election, but then to this process. I would guess that even less people know that this is the process now where they're making these decisions. The public has an opportunity to weigh in, but of course you have to basically be Sherlock Holmes to find, the dates and times for when those meetings happen. And so it's not always super transparent for the public to get involved. But I think there has to be some combination of, the state, the public, and other policymakers to put pressure on the locals to do the responsible thing and set the rates at a reasonable level so that you're not getting these 70% windfalls coming in.
And if we're just talking now, granted, that's, we're talking about revenues. We can talk about that across all forms of municipal taxation. The thing is, and what it'll absolutely make you sick, is you need to look up the comptroller's report on local debt. Especially you get in the ISDs and you go, this is how much debt they have per student. And some of them are leveraged so much that they have, you'll see, for hypothetical, 4,000 students, but, $400,000 of outstanding debt. So it'll be
Bernie Madoff blush.
Yeah. and so or 4 million or 40 million. And you have these massive multiples to where, some districts have their per student debts and 25, 30 grand. And, what if you look at that from a municipal finance perspective, especially these are like urban, not necessarily urban, but urban or suburban districts, one where there isn't a whole lot of room to actually add a student body to that particular district. And if that's the case, how is that debt ever going to get addressed? If people are moving out, which they are, specifically in these rural districts that we talk about all the time, if people are moving out of those rural areas for opportunities, in more urban areas, you're not going that base is not going to grow at the level it needs to satisfy that debt, especially while they're taking on more debt as it goes.
And the next step in that process, which we don't have time for today, we need to move on to some other topics, but the next question is then they're taking in all this debt and they're doing all the spending. Let's actually look at what they're spending it on. Yep. That could be a whole topic of a completely other show. Maybe we'll have James Quintero in here to talk about that, because he is.
Does he have an opinion on that?
Yeah, he is chin deep in some of this stuff, but it's good that we have somebody looking out for that, because some of the stuff that he'll pull out is mind-boggling that they spend all this kind of money, or the kinds of salaries that some of these superintendents, that are coming up here with their hand out, saying, please, may we have another? We're so broke. Turn around and they're making $400,000 in their district.
It's the old Blazing Saddles line. They're coming for our phony baloney jobs.
That's right.
I didn't get a rump out of that guy.
All right. So let's have a couple other topics. Just want to highlight some things that happened this week. I know that the the DEI bill, the bill that would eliminate DEI at all public universities in Texas, did not only pass the legislature during the regular session, but got signed by the governor this week. So that is now officially law. That takes in effect later this year. The one thing I want to highlight from that, something that I learned through this process, is I had a really smart person tell me, one time as I was kind of learning about the sausage being made and, kind of the House versus the Senate and all that kind of stuff. They said, Brian, you need two bills. Only one of them has to be good, but you need two bills. And so you have to get something out of both the House and the Senate so that it can then get into conference committee. And then in this case, there was some concern because the House DEI bill really wasn't that good. In fact, there were some problems with it where it essentially would, entrench DEI or, these former DEI officials in the system. Yeah. And so, then you would just end up having DEI by some other name, rear its ugly head, next year or in the subsequent years. They go to conference and they make the bill a better bill, and ultimately the one that came out. But I thought that was interesting, to say, that's part of the process, which is you need two bills. Only one of them has to be good, but you need two bills.
Exactly. Now, don't get me wrong. It would be negligent to say that the final product does not get voted on in both chambers, because both chambers need to, by majority, assent to the adoption of the conference report. But that being said, look at all the logistical pitfalls that exist along the way when it comes to just any bill. So let's say, it gets sent, the DEI bill, which I believe was House Higher Ed, if I recall correctly. The composition of that committee might be such where the only thing palatable to that committee would be a severely watered down version of that. Not only that, then it goes to calendars, where individuals in calendars committee have the ability to put a hold on the bill, which I remember this passing later in session. A hold later in session tends to be more existential than earlier in session. That being said, it needs to get set to a floor. It needs to survive a vote. It needs to survive all those points of order that are going to be called on it naturally. And then it needs to be voted out. Having a husk of a bill or a bill that's less, I'd say, thorough and doesn't do all the stuff you want it to do might have less political headwinds. Now, the problem is, though, if it's too narrow of a bill, and especially when we have some of the malfeasance that we've had with the current parliamentarian, as we've discussed prior, it's going to say, oh, that's not germane. And, when I say that, I was talking about, there was such an example where a bill was filed, an amendment was added in the House, the amendment was taken out in the Senate, thereby reverting it to the filed bill, and it going back to the House and saying, oh, well, now it's not germane to the bill that was actually filed. But yeah, nonsense like that tends to derail it. But if you have something that's more streamlined, that could get through the process better. And then in conference report, you only need three out of the 5 appointees in each chamber to sign off on that, and then a majority of the chamber once the report is called
up.
And
once it goes back to the chamber, there's no changing it. You either accept it as it is or it dies.
Yeah, it is an up or down vote. It's like you are taking it. It is take it or leave it, and whoever gets 51% wins.
Yeah. So thought that was interesting, and the parliamentary stuff. So anyway, just want to highlight that the DEI bill now is in law. Another one that we've talked about here that got signed this week was removing sexually explicit materials in schools. This was HB 900 from Representative Jared Patterson. This is one that he championed from the very beginning of the year. That a lot of people thought, well, this is just going to be some cultural war stuff or whatever that is not going to go anywhere. And here we are. Not only did it go somewhere, but it became one of the more important bills, I think, that was passed just because of all of the attention that had been around some of these materials that were coming out that were shocking to a lot of people. But one of the things I want to highlight about this is not just the bill. We've talked about that 100 times, but this was one of the bills, one of the 4 or 5 bills I thought where the left was obnoxiously disingenuous about what the bill did.
Oh, this one bill?
One of the 4 or 5 that, were just like on a new level of how obnoxious the left was in how they framed the issue that were the problem, or how they lied, essentially, not even a problem of frame. They lied about what the issue was. And then, of course, how they described what the bills actually did. A couple other ones that that I mentioned here is, this idea of gender affirming care, and that sort of Orwellian discussion when we're talking about, these treatments and puberty blockers on kids. They want to ignore what the real issue is by using these kinds of words. Another one, we talked about the vigilante force, the so-called vigilante force, the border force.
Sounds like an 80s cartoon.
Or a video game or something, where it literally can't be a vigilante force, because that would be a vigilante literally means without authority, and this is a law that would create that force. Another one is just anything that had to do with any of the transgender issues or the drag shows or whatever, all of that being quote unquote anti-gay, right. As you're pulling it all in when some of these bills had absolutely nothing to do with anything anti-gay. So I just thought that there was a really on the few sessions that you've seen a lot more sessions than this, but certainly for me it just seems like this one was even more histrionic, more crazy. You had the massive protests over SB 14 and the gender mod bill, where people were just saying outlandish, crazy things. Protesters trying to get arrested and all of that. And so to get this one across the finish line, get this one to the governor's desk, I thought was a real accomplishment.
Yeah, and it's so funny because it's always these stats that come from niche groups. Like if you ask about because one of the big things with specifically the gender affirming care stuff, so as it's so construed, is the suicidality of the underlying population, which I know I shared it the other day, but a New York Times contributor delved into that because I think the Trevor Project or somebody had been echoing the same talking points of the fact that that there's basically this is a life-saving intervention, which it's not, because the effect of gender affirming care on suicidality is negligible, if at all. And this is a New York Times contributor, very similar to the article that was written up in The Economist. New York Times, The Economist, all again to the right of National Review. This is basically the New York.
You have to drive way to the left to get.
I mean, this is Washington.
So far left.
Washington Post, National Review, New York Times.
Right.
I say that flippantly, but that's the whole thing. Is people are saying, wait, the bill of goods that you've been selling us is not true, and so why do you keep insisting that it is? And obviously this is something that's very it has a lot of gravity to it, a lot of gravitas, and you don't want to, if somebody is in a place where they have suicidal thoughts, you definitely don't want to be putting any due stress on that. But very much like suicidality, affirming beliefs. Let's say somebody had an was having suicidal ideation independent of any sort of gender dysphoria. The last thing you would want to
depression, anxiety, whatever.
Exactly. The last thing you would want to do is affirm that element of that particular diagnosis. Yeah. But what you do is when you get them help and you want to get them stabilized as fast as you can, and Texas should be lauded by putting a lot more resources into that particular pursuit, both generally and in the schools. But that being said, is because it's such an article of faith of the progressive left, you don't see any particular pushback when they just say, oh, well, we'll just have bodies in the streets, and they did a die-in at the Capitol. And all these theatrics, all this performance, it doesn't bother the members any. It doesn't bother the folks who work on these bills at all. But what it is it just shows a lack of understanding of how the political process works. Or selling the sizzle and not the steak, or they're selling the sizzle and not the steak, whereas, this bill's getting, SB 14 will be signed today.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the things where, people that didn't have die-ins but just made their compelling case carried the day.
I think it just, for me, the bigger point here is the way that they debated, some of the left and the Democrats and some others debated these kinds of issues were so disingenuous and so dishonest.
Yeah.
I am worried that it will have an effect on how other issues get debated, or maybe all the issues get debated. I mean, if you've just gone through this and someone's been calling you, anti-gay, or saying that you're responsible for the deaths of kids and things like that, and then all of a sudden you're supposed to sit down and and talk about the budget, and you're supposed to sit down and talk about property tax or something that may not be as partisan across from somebody. It's like, you know what? you're so obnoxious. I'm just going to tell you to pound sand. We're going to grab our majority. We're going to go shove everything down your throat. And I mean, even if Republicans or conservatives are getting bills passed that way, that's not healthy. That's not healthy for the democracy. You want to have a healthy opposition, because I think you do come up with better bills. But because they're pursuing the debate this way, I'm sure lawmakers are just like, you know what? I'm not even going to mess with you if that's the way you're going to debate on this and call, people names and do all of this, make up stuff, lie about what the bills do. And we're constantly having to fight the media who's reporting on all these lies. You know what? Forget it. We're just going to pound these bills down your throat.
Yeah, no, you're completely right. I do think that again, how many times have I said we don't know how to disagree anymore? But to be honest with you, though, we've folks on our side of the aisle have done it too, but they've learned from it. Right?
Sure, yeah, and I should say that absolutely happens.
And like no greater an example than constitutional carry, where I remember they're going to Speaker Bonin's house in 2019, pushing themselves into offices and just absolutely acting a fool up at the legislature, but in 2021, they had a much more coherent message, much more calmly delivered and well researched, and look, that passed that particular session.
All right, so moving on, I want to hit a couple of issues because we only have a few minutes left. I definitely wanted to get to one, which I thought it would be funny, I guess, if it weren't so sad. But there's at least it's only the committee process now. So a Senate committee voted 8-1. I mean, it still had a tremendous support. A Senate committee state Senate committee in California voted 8-1 to classify a parent's affirmation of the child's gender identity as part of the health, safety, and welfare of the child. Now, what does this mean? Essentially, if the child, and there's no stipulation as to what age the child is, it could be a 7-year-old, a 5-year-old, whatever. If the child believes that the child is of a different gender, and your 5-year-old boy says that they're a girl, if the parent does not affirm the child's decision to be a different gender, then they are violating the child's health, safety, and welfare, which is sort of a long way to say child abuse, right? That they're essentially abusing the child. So that happened in the Senate in California. Now makes its way to the floor. One state senator, let's see, his name is Senator Scott Wilkes, said, in the past, when we've had these discussions and I've seen parental rights atrophy, I've encouraged people to keep fighting in California. Now he says, I've changed my mind on that. If you love your children, you need to flee California. You need to flee. I mean, this is jarring, that a state senator is saying our policies are so bad here that I'm legitimately, and not tongue-in-cheek kind of way, like where people say, oh, well, if Donald Trump wins, I'm moving to Canada. He's literally telling they're coming for your children. They're violating the most basic tenets of parental rights. You don't want to be here when the dust settles. You need to flee.
Right, and I think that, I actually, with stuff like this, because I understand the impetus, because if you look at this just through a culture war lens, it does look really bad, and to be honest, I mean, it is really bad. But you see the animating principle in the fact that they do want to, create a safe and welcoming environment. At least that's the way that's the support that it's laid out. But knowing as much as we do about child welfare and how that works and how this would be weaponized, that's what should give and that's what Senator Wilk is saying. That is what should give everybody pause, is because, again, even when we talk here about some of the work on SB 14, one of the big things in that bill is that it doesn't criminalize the parents. And I know that that's a hotly debated bit, when we've taken stones on our side from that. But using a state bureaucracy, and let me tell you, the state bureaucracy, even a conservative state like Texas, is not in your team. It's not on your team. It's not in your camp. It's not your friend. The state bureaucracy, much like we see with these superintendents, exists nothing for no other purpose but then for its own self-perpetuation. Using that to break up families, as it will happen here in California, almost explicitly, is going to be tragic. And so one of the things that we've avoided on our side is to make sure that we're avoiding doing that, because we can't be weaponizing the state like that. But looking at what he said, though, in total, I don't know how to disagree. California specifically, I think they have a Senator Scott Wiener, who's I mean, that guy is just like an absolute harlequin when it comes to some of the stuff that guy passes. He was one of the ones who let's call it MPOX just to make sure that we're not being disparaging in any way, that kind of guy. But that being said, it's all these ideas that more subscribe to these particular pieties, these articles of faith that exist on the left that just simply aren't true. And they'll tell you though, if there's a parent who wants to get their child out of California, they are more than welcome to come here, knowing full well this is the state is run in this certain way. We're more than welcome. We're more than welcome here. But I think they would also see that, like, look, you are going to have that authority over your over your child's development. Hopefully, insofar as it also applies to education selection as well here shortly. But you are going to have that ability because we believe in the family unit as opposed to believing that the state is your family.
Yeah, we joke about, people not moving to Texas or, especially people from California not moving to Texas. Don't California my Texas, all that kind of stuff. But if you are one of those parents and you're worried about the way the direction of your state is going, particularly this way, come one, come all. We will change our asylum rules or something so that you can come here freely. And
we still need the quarantine period.
Yeah,
I think
you pick your Dallas Cowboy jersey up at the border and you can come right in.
Ooh, careful. Houston area transplants might have a problem with that.
All right, so moving on, I wanted to hit one other thing just because I thought it was funny and a little bit of shocking, and it's one of the issues that we've talked about here before, which is this ESG, environmental, social, and governance scores. So this is we wanted to highlight that these scores and these indices that some of these self-appointed ratings companies use, like the Human Rights Campaign and others. These scores about whether or not you are woke enough, essentially, are the ways that they coerce companies. You look at the hospitals and major institutions and you say, well, why are they pursuing the gender modification, or why are they pursuing these woke policies? And it's stuff like these scores that ultimately that can come to hurt you, whether it's you be subject to lawsuits and things, discriminatory lawsuits, or a lack of investment by investors because your ESG score is not high enough. Well, this is kind of backfiring because some companies are playing along with this, and some companies are embracing it because it will improve their reputation. So apparently cigarette companies are getting a much higher ESG score than even renewable companies like Tesla. Tesla, which fashions itself as the future of cars and electric cars and not using fossil fuels. ESG ratings are supposed to guide investors and their money toward what they say are ethical enterprises. But S&P Global made news this week when Tesla, the world's largest manufacturer of electric cars, gave them a lower ESG score than Philip Morris International, which of course is the maker of Marlboro cigarettes. And it wasn't just 10 or 15 points lower, it was like 50 points lower. And so as you read through the article, you find out that essentially these companies are gaming the system, and they're looking at the racial composition of their boards or the gender composition of various positions at their companies, and they're saying, well, because you're doing those things, then you're a very ethical company, even though cigarettes, of course, kill 8 million people every year. Tesla's not quite there. I know that they've had some accidents with their cars, but they're not quite yet killing 8 million people. And so, anyway, this is just sort of an example of how this ESG thing totally distorts, frankly, coerces these companies into this kind of thing. And of course, you get this product where a cigarette company is more ethical than an electric car company. Anyway, any feedback on that, Derek?
Yeah, it's funny because does it surprise me? Absolutely not. And Philip Morris, I carry no water for them, nor do I bear ill will against them. I think they're just a international product manufacturer who, whose product, might be not seen as in vogue with the times or whatever the case might be. But that being said, if you look at the way this just is it just completely lays out the perfect case that all these are arbitrary distinctions, these arbitrary ratings. And, we used to have a way of looking at the particulars of a business and its value to the larger economy, and that was basically return on shareholder investment, right? And return on shareholder investment, it's not a perfect way of gauging, well, are they because ESG is like, oh, are they generating these externalities, which started off as just being like, are they putting out a lot of pollution, which now it's more just like, are they putting off structural racism or whatever the case might be,
right.
And
White
so
supremacy.
it's whatever the cause celeb on the left is, and gets factored into these scores, and these scores are meaningless.
Totally.
Now, here's the thing. There is a million different laws on the federal level and the state level that requires corporate disclosure and corporate governance to produce documents on certain elements, whether it's pollution, whether it's human trafficking, whether it's how much, power. I know some of the states like require, what's your carbon footprint look like? And we can argue about the wisdom of that. That's fine. That's disclosure. Let the people invest in who they want to invest in. Let the, even these, even some of these, fund groups, actually have funds based on values. I know for a fact that there's, Catholic funds that don't don't invest in companies that have, pro-abortion policies or anti-family policies. And so that's one way of sorting it out. But here's the thing. If it turned out that all the, all the Catholic ETFs were just absolutely hemorrhaging money, were completely mismanaged, were so far under the market average that they were not sustainable, people will either go take their money somewhere else, or they will say, well, now I am, keeping my money here as a principled position. Is it worth, that to have these particular policies that I want to see put out by the companies I support? That we call that a market process. Right. That is an open market process. The problem is that we have this arbitrary thing where you can take back to your board, oh, look, we invested in this company because the ESG score is 100. It's like, well, what do you do? Well, we took an absolute bath in the portfolio, but we invested in this high company. It's like,
but we're good people because we invested in the company they told us to invest in.
And that's fine. But, if you look at some of the work we've done here in Texas, not only with SB 13 last year, but with, Tom Oliverson's bill this year, we're getting that out of insurance because you can't let that get into rate making. What your insurance rate making process needs to look like is somebody looking at a particular enterprise and going, what is the risk exposure?
Right.
Not what is the systemic racism exposure.
What is footprint?
Yeah, what is a carbon footprint? Now, here's the thing. If you have something where a carbon footprint's relevant to your risk exposure, and I'm not talking through some tertiary bank shot where we're saying, oh, well, climate change, right?
Right.
I'm saying, like, literally, if you are putting out some sort of pollutant, into some sort of common waterway, and you might be subject to some mass tort, and they're covering your lawyer's bills,
right.
Yeah, that's relevant, okay? Nobody's saying that's not.
Fair, that's fair.
But that being said, that has nothing to do with the woke nonsense we're seeing now, and this is getting away from actually satisfying their fiduciary duty to shareholders.
They don't have any people who identify as trans on their executive board, so you shouldn't invest in them. I mean, things like that are making ridiculous decisions that are as you said, hurting their portfolios.
Why can't Tesla just identify as having a 100% score?
Exactly. We should put it back on them. But you have seen, and we've talked about it, some of the good news coming out, and the Wall Street Journal and other places are actually showing that companies are worried about doing this ESG investing for those reasons, because they should be a fiduciary and because they'll be subject to lawsuits if they're making these decisions, which are, might be quote unquote good for the planet or good for the culture, but actually bad for people's bottom lines and pocketbooks. So anyway, we've talked about a bunch of stuff today. We only have a couple more minutes left, so we'll close it right there. As always, we really, really appreciate your feedback. We appreciate your comments. We love our listeners and all the feedback that we get from them. We appreciate you watching and listening each week. Again, we are going to be going every 2 weeks now, so that we can have a lot to talk about between each show. And so we will see you in a couple weeks. As always, do good and risk the consequences. We'll see you next time.